Beautiful, beautiful song, and I do apologize for don't when Sharm contacts you this next week, don't negate. I mean, don't decline. There's another reading or two coming up from Ecclesiastes. There may be one that's actually optimistic. But in reality, there's more to these readings, right, than meets the eye, I think. That's the whole point of going through this series, I think. But at the same time, they're not the most chipper verses to be read. They can be troubling. And the reality is that now we're in this fourth week. We have 2 more weeks after this of this series that we're calling Catch Fire, living the exuberant life. And you're probably sitting here kind of wondering, okay, when does the exuberance come in? And so far, I'd have to say it really is one of the most mysterious books. I mean, Ecclesiastes has this. It doesn't fit into any other genre other than we sort of fit it into this genre of wisdom. But even then, it's not like Proverbs, which is sort of a whole series of instructions. It's not like the Song of Solomon, which is also sort of like a whole series of instructions. It's not like the Psalms, which are prayers. It's this whole sort of conglomeration, this compendium of sayings, of didactic or what we call dialectic thinking. And actually, it arises out of the period of the 4th, 3rd century, which, if you think about it, now it says Solomon. It creates this sort of pseudonym, this connection to Solomon as far as its teaching content. But in fact, the science and archaeologists pinpoint this thing being written somewhere around the 4th and 3rd century. Solomon was around the 9th century. So it's a newer piece than that, but it's at the time of the Persian Greek sort of rule and influence for Judaism. And you can sense that in this. There's some of this sort of Greek philosophy that seems to be going on because you have this dialectic process. The dialectic process of Socrates, and of course Socrates was, 3rd century as well, or 4th century. So what you have is this idea of it's not that, therefore what else could it be? It's sort of what we call apophatic, sort of negation of things. Or if you remember when we talked a lot, when Charles was here, and we talked a lot about creation spirituality, it's sort of the path of the via negativa. It's the path of inward reflection and sort of just taking things apart to see what's there. And that's the challenge, I think, with this, because with all of its language, it feels like I'm leading you down this sort of labyrinthine collection of existential questions on the meaningfulness or meaninglessness of life. And there's no purpose, there's no point to it. And it's just like our song this morning from the Propellerheads. They say the next big thing is here, the revolution's near, but to me it seems quite clear it's all just a little bit of history repeating. And I've seen it before, and I'll see it again, and I'll see it again, and it just kind of keeps going on this cycle that seems never ending. How does this lead to a sense of exuberance? How is this helpful? And yet, I'm going to argue that Ecclesiastes is perhaps one of the best self-help books there is. I think you should all go home and read it. I'm serious. I think you should all go home and read it. For one thing, after you read it for a while, you'll start sensing he really is right. This thing is very confusing. It goes from a series of sort of dialectic discussions, and then it goes into this poetry that we read last week. There's a time for every season under heaven, and then it comes to this point where we're back into kind of dialectics, and then there'll be a whole series of proverbs sort of things about how a person should live their life in relationship to God. And then it'll come back to this parable about a king who seeks after life, and then what does the king find? But nothing. It's all blowing in the wind. And then you come further down, and then you're back to sort of this dialectic thing. Everything seems to be sort of just placed in a compendium rather than a narrative that flows from beginning to end. And this idea of via negativa, this idea of dismantling is unfamiliar to us. It doesn't seem right? Because we're not used to dialectics, we're used to didactics. We're used to being told what to think. We're used to being told what we know is right because we were born into this system and grew up with this reality, and therefore I know it must be right. And I've studied it really hard, which means I haven't really taken it apart. I've just regurgitated it. And now I'm giving it to you. And now you're supposed to take it, and that's comfortable, and it feels good because mostly we're afraid of things that aren't familiar to us. And so it feels good to sort of have didactics. This is not didactics. This is saying you like your life? Fine, it's going to end. So you made a lot of money. Great. What are you going to do with it after you die? Right? I mean, it sort of destroys everything. It takes it all apart. Remember this story about the rabbi that was about to die, and then the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic faith, and so his disciples gathered up to him beside the bed as he was there, and they listened to his last teaching. And some of you have heard this, but I'll remind the rest of you. And he says he's just gasping, just barely clinging on to life, and they've followed him for so many years. It's like, one last teaching, Rabbi, one last teaching, and then we'll pass it along so that we can contain those teachings. And he says, fine, then fine. And he's laying in the bed. He opens his eyes and he says, life, it's sort of fits with the song. I hadn't realized that. But he says, life is like a river. And then he closes his eyes, and they said, Rabbi, what do you mean, Rabbi? But he's just resting quietly and can't be aroused. And so finally they ponder it for a moment. These disciples that are closest to him, of course, are the most learned. They're the wisest. Otherwise, why would they be closest to him? And so they begin to toss this thing around, and they begin to sort of recogitate it. You know, life is like a river. Life is like a river. Life flows. Life moves. Life is like a river. And then they pass it around the room, and then it passes down the hallway where more disciples are lined up and more anxious people out the door and down the street waiting to hear these final words of the rabbi, their teacher. Life is like a river. And as it passes along down the way, of course, it's like that post office game. You remember that game, or the telephone game? It's something about a river. There are rivers in life. There are lots of rivers in life. And as it gets towards the end, the guy at the end, the only one that has the courage to sort of say, wait a minute, the emperor's naked, says, life is like a river? What does that mean? Life is full of rivers. Life is like a... Tell the rabbi, it makes no sense. What does he mean? And so the question comes back up the road. You know, what does the rabbi mean? What do you mean life is like a river? And it comes all the way back to the house, comes up the steps, it comes down the hall, comes around the room. What does the rabbi mean? Life is like a river. Comes back to the rabbi, who surprisingly is still alive. And they lean over to him now, and it's been half the day of this thing. They lean over, they say, Rabbi, we are sorry. Rabbi, please wake up. What do you mean life is like a river? We don't understand. And he looks up with one last gasp through his barely cracked eyes and says, so who knows? Maybe it's not. And dies. That is this idea of apophatic thinking, this idea of dialectic. It's this orientation and disorientation. Lord knows life can be disorienting as it is, right? I mean, the reality of our lives is much like what Koheles says. We're going along and everything's fine, and then boom, the carpet's taken out from underneath us. Or we're kicked in the gut, and suddenly we realize that life isn't like we thought it was going to be. It's much more challenging. We weren't prepared for this. And yet, there's something to this process that Koheles is saying. There's something to all these barrage of negations and bleak outlooks on life that our text is saying that it hardly seems that the stuff of helpful advice and motivation for living. I'll reiterate what Anne had read, a little paraphrasing. I observed all the work and the ambition motivated by envy. What a waste. It's just smoke. Breath on breath. The fool sits back, takes it easy in his sloth, but it's slow self-destruction. And then out of nowhere, he recites a proverb. You might not have made that connection, but he recites a proverb, which is, one handful of peaceful repose is better than two fistfuls of worried work spitting in the wind. It's just a waste of time. I tested all of these things by wisdom, I thought I'll be wise, but then it eluded me. All that happens is utterly unfathomable, so who can grasp it? I turned my mind to seek wisdom, along with an account of things, to know that wickedness is foolishness, folly is madness. This alone I thought was helpful. God made human beings straightforward, and yet human beings seem to want to complicate things. Where's our cartoon? Can we show that? Ah, yes. Can you read that? Don't hang on. Yeah, remember this? Dust in the wind? All we are is dust in the wind. Oh, anyway, okay. I thought it would be fun. Linda said it would be a great thing. Throw it up there. There's something profoundly helpful about Ecclesiastes that compelled American novelist Tom Wolfe to write this. Of all that I have ever seen or learned, this book seems to be the noblest, the wisest, the most powerful expression of man's life on this earth, and the highest flower of poetry, eloquence, and truth. He says, I'm not given to dogmatic judgment in the matter of literary creation, but if I had to make one, I would say Ecclesiastes is the greatest single piece of writing I have ever known, and the wisdom expressed the most lasting and profound. How in the world could he be saying something like that about Ecclesiastes that most of us probably wouldn't want to sit and read before we go to bed at night? And yet there's something in here that I think we should all be reading on a regular basis. This idea of taking things apart, of taking masks down, of bearing ourselves open to the reality of life, to begin to realize that at the heart of life is life itself. In the heart of the reality of the cycle of life and death and unexpected twists and plot turns is life itself. And this seems to be what Kohelet's point is. To challenge his listeners to see beyond the masks of ambition or greed, to vulnerably open up and lift the veil of fear, and to see life in all of its absurdity and in all of its redundancy, and then to do something, to wake up. To wake up and to see the reality. If you'll throw this up there, Ian, if you'll throw the next thing. Because really what he's saying there is, I think he's not saying this is all there is. What I think he's saying when we finally wake up is he is saying there is all this. You see the difference? How easy it is for us to fall into this simple trap that he himself falls into. This is all there is. What's the point? When in reality, it's all there. This is all there. There is all of this in front of us. My uncle used to drive us out to West Texas when we would go out camping out in the Guadalupe Mountains, and I remember that our whole point was to get from destination A to destination C, and we had to drive through B, which was about 400 miles of desert in West Texas, right? And there's absolutely nothing to see. And I remember how my uncle would pull over to just, first of all, he loved to see those, what my brother called hysterical markers. You know, because they'd be out there and there'd be something like saying, this area was settled by so-and-so, you know, somebody famous, you know, Josiah Wilbarger settled this area out here. And my brother would look out there and go, there's a cactus and a tumbleweed. There's nothing here, right? But my uncle would have the whole story about what had transpired because he would dig into it. He would go back and look at the history of the land and what peoples were there. And suddenly that area came to life as if we were almost watching a movie take place in front of us. And sometimes he would pull over and he would see some rocks, but then he would see the stratification in the rock. And as he would stop, we'd look at, what are we doing here? And he'd pull up close and he'd get us to walk out there and look at where the stratification would change. Suddenly it might be rock and dirt on the top, but right there in the middle, why in the middle? Why right there? There was a little flower growing out of the middle of it. He'd say, why do you think that is? And we go, we don't know. He said, well, isn't that interesting? So everything became interesting to him. Life became interesting to him. And what I want to think with you is about what ultimately, that what he is saying in Kohelet, what Ecclesiastes is ultimately saying, that yes, life is full of these unpredictable moments, it's full of these ups and downs, but there is at the core of life this invitation to live life. Not in spite of it, but because of it. But not simply just to live it. He actually uses the word to enjoy. We'll come back to this later on in this series, but he uses the word enjoy. And I want to play with this word for just a moment to give you something to think about. This word enjoy life, if you look at the word enjoy in the Greek and Latin root meaning, do you know what that means? We think enjoy life means just to have fun, sort of, enjoy, have pleasure. It's not at all. Enjoy actually means to bring joy to the moment. In, to make, joy, pleasure. It literally means to bring joy to the moment. Life as it is. We live in a whole world of basically, we're going to talk about this next week if you know game theory. We live basically in a zero-sum world, right? Winners and losers, winners and losers, winners and losers. Protesters against protesters, right? Right and wrong. We live in a world that's always zero-sum. competition. But that's not the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is a non-zero sum. It's a win-win situation. It's something beneath all of life that we all connect to and we find in one another. And that's what he's saying here. What he's saying here is that in spite of what life throws at us, we are invited to bring life to the moment. And only when we do that do we find meaning in life. The problem with us is that we think that the meaning of life is the way we sort of lay out the narrative, right? Or the way that we've been taught to lay out the narrative, the way that things flow from one point to the next. But we all know that's not what happens. Ultimately, something comes along and changes up. Life is full of more plot twists, which is why, Sharman, I thought this was such a great card to just send out. Because what do you do? What do you do? There's nothing you can do when it throws a rock at your face and you forgot to dodge, or it hits you in the gut and you just have to bend over for a moment. The only thing you can do is look at my narrative. There's a plot twist. How can I bring life to this moment? Because that's what we're invited to do. We're invited to participate in it. And sometimes, as Sharm shared a few weeks ago, we have to lean on one another, right? We have to lean on the strength that we forgot is there, but that we have. And sometimes we have to remember how we dealt with these kinds of plot twists in the past. But the point of all of this is to not shrug, not run, not hide, not cover up, but to bear open and to bring life to life. I want to end with just this last little piece here. There is a Chinese saying that goes like this. Oh, band, you guys can come on up. Thanks. I always forget to remind you guys to come up. If you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. Or some of you go shopping. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. For most people, it doesn't last more than a year. If you want happiness for a lifetime, connect with somebody and help. And isn't that really the truth? When we find ourselves in the lowest places we can, or that we often sometimes do, what really helps ultimately? It's the connection. Sometimes it's someone reaching out to us, and sometimes if that's not happening, then what we're invited to do when Koheleth finally says, everything I've done has still shown that it's all to waste. It's all just smoke. Incidentally, that word hevel, smoke, it actually means breath on breath, the tiniest of breath on breath. In a sense, I like to rethink that whole idea that it's just disappearing dust in the wind, because it's really reminding us that we're all connected. Breath on breath. Sometimes it's the slightest, slimmest sense of a breath that's there, and yet it's there. We share it with one another. We are invited to create, to make life, bring life to life. That's our invitation. So next week, I'm just going to finish here. Next week, what we're going to do is I want you to come back, because next week I'm going to have the most fun that I've had in this whole series. I don't know if you're into game theory. I'm not. I don't play games, but yes, I do. I play lots of games. I play games with people all the time. But I don't know if you know game theory, zero thumb, non-zero sum theory, but it's really pretty fascinating. It's where we are in the church right now, honestly, where we're dealing with the sexuality and how we're looking and facing sexuality. We have the groups that think life is just a zero sum, right? There's just winners, losers. My way, your way's wrong, my way's right. But there's also this whole movement in the church that met this last week here in Fort Worth, and then meeting next week in Georgetown, meeting all over the country, called the Uniting Methodist Movement, which is really who we've been all along. It's really who we've been all along. Open doors, open minds, open hearts. God's love is big. So whoever you are, whatever you think, it's all right. We can all sit at the table of Christ's love. We can all sit there. My family does. If I've told you those stories many, many times, my family does it all the time. Some of your families do too. We can do that. But it's hard to get there. So I have this, the next week's sermon is called, The Situation is Hopeless. But it's not serious. And we're going to look at zero-sum theory and play around with how do we get to win-win in life. Just how do we get there? So I hope you come back for that. And band, let's go out with this song.